Ethan Carter was a man who had everything: wealth, power, and influence. As the CEO of Carter Enterprises, he had built his business empire from the ground up, earning a reputation as a ruthless and shrewd businessman. Yet, despite his immense success, there was one thing in his life that even money couldn't fix: his son, Oliver. At just 10 years old, Oliver had already faced more challenges than most people do in a lifetime. Born with cerebral palsy, he required constant care and struggled with basic tasks that other children took for granted. Ethan, despite his wealth, had never been able to find someone who truly cared for Oliver out of kindness rather than obligation. Every caregiver, every therapist, every teacher, they all did their jobs, but there was always a certain distance, a sense of duty rather than affection. And that realization, no matter how much Ethan tried to ignore it, gnawed at him. One crisp autumn afternoon, Oliver made an unusual request. Instead of dining at one of the luxurious restaurants they usually visited, he wanted to eat at a small, cozy diner on the outskirts of the city. Ethan, always one to prefer fine dining and impeccable service, hesitated. A place like that wasn't where he would typically take his son. But there was something about the way Oliver's blue eyes lit up with excitement that made him pause. "Please, Dad? Just this once?" Oliver pleaded, his voice filled with hope. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his neatly combed hair. He rarely denied Oliver anything, but this was out of his comfort zone. Still, seeing the eagerness on his son's face, he found himself relenting. "All right," he said, forcing a small smile. "Let's give it a try." As they pulled into the diner's tiny parking lot, Ethan felt an odd sense of discomfort. The neon sign flickered slightly, and the scent of coffee and sizzling bacon drifted through the cool air. It was a far cry from the five-star restaurants he was used to, but Oliver seemed thrilled. The boy practically bounced in his seat, eager to experience something new. The moment they stepped inside, they were greeted by the warm, homey scent of pancakes and syrup. The diner was modest, with checkered tablecloths and slightly worn-out booths, but it exuded a certain charm. Ethan, however, remained skeptical, scanning the room with the critical eye of a businessman who was used to the best of everything. Little did he know, this unassuming diner and the person they were about to meet would change the course of their lives forever. Ethan Carter sat across from Oliver in the worn-out booth, his mind barely present. His fingers tapped rhythmically against the polished surface of his phone, eyes scanning through emails, stock reports, and urgent messages that demanded his attention. He was here physically, but mentally, he was 1,000 miles away, buried in business deals and profit margins. Meanwhile, Oliver was struggling. His small hands, unsteady from his condition, trembled as he tried to grip his fork. He was determined, his brows furrowed in deep concentration as he attempted to spear a piece of pancake. But each time he almost had it, the piece would slip back onto his plate, taunting him. He tried again. And again. His lips pressed together in frustration, his once excited demeanor now dimming. Ethan didn't notice. But someone else did. Sophie Lane had been working at the diner for years, pulling double shifts just to make ends meet. She had learned to recognize exhaustion in people's faces, had seen families come and go, some filled with joy, others weighed down by unseen burdens. But when her eyes landed on the little boy struggling with his meal, something in her chest tightened. She wasn't sure why it struck her so deeply. Maybe it was the way his small fingers clenched around the fork, refusing to give up despite repeated failure. Maybe it was the quiet frustration in his expression, the kind of frustration that came not from the difficulty of the task, but from the silent understanding that no one was paying attention. Without hesitation, Sophie walked over. She crouched down beside Oliver, her voice warm and gentle, as if she were speaking to an old friend. "Hey there, buddy," she said with a soft smile. "Looks like those pancakes are being a little tricky, huh?" Oliver startled slightly, his blue eyes widening as he looked at her. He hadn't expected anyone to notice, especially not a stranger. Sophie waited patiently, offering him a reassuring smile. Finally, after a small pause, Oliver gave a shy nod. "Yeah," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Well," Sophie said playfully, tapping her chin, "I happen to be a pancake expert. Would you like a little help?" Oliver hesitated, glancing quickly at his father, who was still engrossed in his phone. Then, as if making a silent decision for himself, he nodded again. Yes, please. Sophie carefully took his fork, her movements slow and deliberate, making sure he saw everything she was doing. She cut his pancakes into bite-sized pieces, then gently guided his hand to hold the fork properly. There we go, she said cheerfully. Now, let's try again. This time, those pancakes don't stand a chance. She made an exaggerated face of determination, pretending to glare at the pancake pieces as if they were little troublemakers. Oliver giggled, a light, genuine sound that carried through the small diner. Sophie grinned, satisfied. She continued chatting with him, throwing in small jokes about pancakes being sneaky and expert escape artists. Oliver laughed between bites, the frustration from earlier completely forgotten. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't just a child with cerebral palsy struggling with a task. He was just a kid, laughing over breakfast with someone who treated him like any other little boy. And then, Ethan finally looked up. At first, his instinct was to interrupt, to remind Sophie that Oliver was capable, that they didn't need charity or special treatment. But the words never left his lips. Because for the first time in a long time, Ethan saw something different in Oliver's face. A lightness, an ease, a joy that had been absent for far too long. He set his phone down. Ethan had spent years ensuring that his son had the best of everything, the best doctors, the best therapists, the best caregivers. But no one, not a single person, had ever treated Oliver quite like this. Not with pity, not with discomfort, but with genuine warmth and friendship. And as he sat there, watching his son giggle and smile with a waitress he had never met before today, Ethan Carter, the billionaire who believed money could fix anything, was struck by a realization. Some things in life, no matter how much wealth or influence one had, could never be bought. Ethan Carter had always been a man who thrived on control. He built his empire with precision, calculated every risk, and prided himself on always being a step ahead. Surprises were for the unprepared, for those who didn't plan well enough. And yet, as he sat in the driver's seat on the way home, gripping the steering wheel a little too tightly, he felt completely out of his depth. Beside him, Oliver was uncharacteristically chatty. Normally, the boy was quiet after meals, his energy drained from simply navigating the physical struggles of his condition. But today, he was buzzing with excitement. Sophie was really nice, Dad, Oliver said, kicking his feet happily against the seat. She didn't act weird around me. She just talked to me. Like a real person. Ethan's fingers tightened slightly around the wheel. Like a real person, the words stung more than he cared to admit. Had Oliver felt like less than that with everyone else? Had Ethan, his own father, unintentionally made him feel that way too? Oliver kept talking, his voice filled with the kind of joy Ethan hadn't heard in years. She made the pancakes into little squares. She said they were bite-sized superpowers. He giggled. And when I dropped my fork, she didn't make a big deal about it. She just helped me like it was nothing. Ethan barely responded, only managing to quiet him as he stared at the road ahead. He could feel the weight of something heavy settling on his chest, something unfamiliar and deeply unsettling. He had spent years making sure Oliver had the best, private tutors, the top therapists, doctors with international reputations. But none of them had given Oliver what Sophie had in a matter of minutes. The realization was like a punch to the gut. When they arrived home, Oliver was still in high spirits. He chatted about Sophie through dinner, his excitement unwavering even as Ethan remained uncharacteristically quiet. Later that evening, as Ethan tucked his son into bed, he lingered at the doorway longer than usual. Oliver, already snuggled beneath his blankets, looked up at him sleepily. "Dad?" Ethan hesitated. "You really liked her, didn't you?" Oliver's answer was immediate. "Yeah," he said, nodding against his pillow. "She didn't treat me like I was different. She just talked to me." Ethan swallowed hard. "I see." The boy blinked up at him, his blue eyes soft with exhaustion. "Do you think we'll see her again?" Ethan had no answer. He simply reached forward, brushing a strand of hair from Oliver's forehead before standing up. "Get some sleep, kiddo." As he left the room, he felt an unease that had nothing to do with business. For years, he had assumed his money, his resources, his connections had provided Oliver with everything he needed. He had told himself that if he hired the best professionals, his son would be okay. But tonight, he wasn't so sure anymore. The next morning, Ethan sat at the breakfast table, nursing a cup of black coffee. His usual routine involved reading financial reports, responding to emails, and diving straight into work. But today, his mind was elsewhere. His phone sat on the table beside him. One call. That's all it would take. He had never been one to reach out first. He was a man people chased after, a man whose time was valuable and whose presence was demanded in boardrooms, not small diners. But now, for the first time in years, he hesitated. Finally, with a deep breath, he picked up the phone and dialed. The line rang a few times before a familiar voice answered. "Mr. Carter?" Sophie's tone was polite but cautious. He could almost hear the surprise in her voice. Ethan exhaled, pressing his fingers against the bridge of his nose. He wasn't sure why this felt harder than negotiating multi-million-dollar contracts. "I wanted to thank you for yesterday," he said finally. "You were good with Oliver." There was a small pause. Then, Sophie's voice softened. "He's a great kid." "It was my pleasure." Ethan hesitated. He wasn't used to feeling unsure of his words. But something about this felt important, like a door he hadn't realized existed had suddenly opened before him. "Would you?" He stopped, rethinking his words, then forced himself to continue. "Would you consider having dinner with us tonight? Oliver would love to see you again." Silence stretched for a moment, and Ethan found himself gripping the phone a little tighter. He wasn't used to asking for things, especially not favors. Finally, Sophie responded, her voice carrying a hint of amusement. "All right," she said. "I'd like that." Ethan nodded to himself before realizing she couldn't see him. "Good. I'll send a car for you." "I can take the bus," she replied casually. Ethan frowned. "No. I'll send a car." Sophie laughed lightly. "All right, Mr. Carter." Ethan hung up, staring at the phone in his hands. This was new. This was unfamiliar territory. He wasn't used to letting people in. He wasn't used to admitting he didn't have all the answers. But as he glanced toward Oliver's room, where his son was still humming happily to himself, he realized something. Change was coming. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan Carter wasn't going to fight it. Dinner had started smoothly, even pleasantly. The warmth in the dining room was unlike anything Ethan Carter had experienced in years. Sophie sat across from him, laughing at one of Oliver's enthusiastic stories, and for a brief moment, Ethan allowed himself to imagine that this was normal, that this was just another family dinner, filled with easy conversation and genuine connection. But he knew better. He had spent years constructing walls, surrounding himself with control and precision. And yet, tonight, those walls felt fragile, as if Sophie's mere presence was enough to make them crumble. Midway through dinner, he decided to break his silence. "You mentioned last night that you've been working double shifts," he said, setting down his wine glass. "Is that to pay for school?" Sophie's smile faltered for the first time that evening. There was a brief hesitation before she shook her head. "No. It's for my mother. She's sick. Cancer." The words hit harder than Ethan expected. He had anticipated financial struggles, maybe even student debt, but this was different. His grip tightened around his fork. Cancer was something that even money couldn't always fix. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice lower, steadier than he felt inside. Sophie shrugged, but there was a tightness to her expression. "We're managing," she said simply. Ethan studied her for a moment, something stirring inside him that he didn't quite recognize. Sophie had shown Oliver kindness when no one else had. She had treated his son like he was just another 10-year-old boy, not as a burden or an obligation. That wasn't something he could ignore. He made a decision. "I want to help," he said. Sophie blinked, looking at him with surprise. "Mr. Carter." He held up a hand. "Not charity. A job." He exhaled, settling back against his chair. "I want you to be Oliver's full-time caregiver." You'd live here, have a generous salary. And your mother's medical bills would be taken care of. The room fell into complete silence. Oliver's fork clinked softly against his plate as he stared between them, eyes wide with excitement. But Sophie looked frozen. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Why would you do that? Ethan met her gaze, unwavering. Because you gave my son something I never could. Sophie swallowed, her expression unreadable. Then, before she could answer, a sudden ringing sound shattered the silence. Ethan frowned, instinctively reaching for his phone, but it wasn't coming from him. It was Sophie's. Her face went pale. She quickly pulled her phone from her pocket, glancing at the screen. Whatever she saw there made her shoulders stiffen. Without a word, she stood up. I'm sorry, she said hurriedly. I have to take this. She stepped onto the balcony, her voice hushed as she answered the call. Ethan watched her go, a strange unease settling in his chest. Something about her reaction didn't sit right with him. It wasn't just urgency, it was something else. Something deeper. He glanced at Oliver, who had gone uncharacteristically quiet. His son was staring toward the balcony, his small hands clenched together on the table. Dad? Oliver asked hesitantly. Ethan turned to him. What is it? Oliver shifted in his seat, looking uncertain. I think I know that ringtone. Ethan frowned. What do you mean? Oliver hesitated, biting his lip. Mom used to have the same one. For a moment, Ethan's entire world tilted. He sat perfectly still, his mind racing. It was ridiculous. A coincidence, surely. Plenty of people had the same ringtone. But something about Oliver's certainty made his skin prickle with unease. His pulse pounded in his ears as he turned his gaze back to the balcony. Sophie was still talking, but now Ethan could see the way her hand was gripping the railing, how her posture had changed, rigid, tense, almost defensive. A knot formed in his stomach. Sophie returned a minute later, visibly shaken. She slipped her phone back into her pocket, forcing a small, apologetic smile. Sorry about that. It was just... Before she could finish, Oliver interrupted. Sophie? His voice was cautious, careful. What's your last name? She blinked, caught off guard by the question. Lane, she answered automatically. Ethan felt the breath leave his lungs. Lane. The name hit him like a wrecking ball, knocking the air from his chest. For years, he had buried the past. Oliver's mother had left when he was just a baby, vanishing without a trace. No explanation, no goodbye. Just gone. Ethan had spent years refusing to speak of her, erasing her existence from their lives. And yet now, Sophie Lane was standing in front of him, unknowingly dragging all of those buried memories back to the surface. His throat felt tight. His mind raced through every interaction, every moment since they had met. The resemblance was subtle but undeniable, the shape of her eyes, the curve of her nose, the way her expression softened when she looked at Oliver. The room felt smaller. His heartbeat pounded against his ribs. No. It couldn't be. But deep down, Ethan already knew the truth. Sophie wasn't just some kind-hearted waitress. She wasn't just a stranger who had stumbled into their lives. She was Oliver's half-sister.